on this episode of Murder Uncovered.
In January of 1997, the Child Protection Unit were looking into the disappearance of a young boy called Henry Bakers. You know, you never walk in and say, I'm dealing with a serial killer.
He raped them, he sodomized them, and he murdered them.
They would have their last sort of death throes, and that would cause him to have his orgasm.
He divulged to us that he put toilet paper up his anus so that he could have sex with him.
He was literally treated like a dog.
It's one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. His own daughter had gone missing a few years earlier. You're like this good looker, the chicks like you, but you've never cut a woman's sexual organs apart and eaten it.
In 1997, in the South African seaside town of Port Elizabeth, the economic hub of the Eastern Cape Province, a young boy had gone missing under suspicious circumstances.
In January of 1997, the Child Protection Unit were looking into the disappearance of a young boy called Henry Bakers. So he was about 12 years old. He disappeared on his way home from his grandparents' house, and where he was last visibly seen had been seen with our suspect, Stuart Wilken, alias Boetie Boer.
Boetie Boer, as he was known in the community, was a local fisherman who had been on the radar of law enforcement for some time. With a history of petty crime, Stuart Wilken had previously dated Henry Baker's mother, so was known to the boy. Two other matters heightened the urgency to investigate Wilken. He was out on bail at the time, charged with the sodomy of his two stepsons, and he had been a major suspect in a similarly disturbing case from 2 years earlier.
His own daughter had gone missing a few years earlier, and he had been implicated there again as being seen with her last.
Now he had raised enough suspicions to push police to speak to him in more depth.
The initial feeling when I walked into the room was never that, you never walk in and say, I'm dealing with a serial killer, because we didn't know at that stage. You know, you're dealing with a potential sex offender. He looked quite disheveled. It was obvious to me he was potentially living on drugs. And he had created this persona amongst the people that he called himself some alter ego, Boetie Boer. Ek is Boetie Boer. And then he's like, take my bag from me because there's a knife in here and I can kill you with that knife. And I was going, oh my Lord. So once we'd got him talking about himself, I think that was the open sesame, if I can put it that way. He wanted to talk, he wanted to be heard. He didn't want to be caught. During the interview, we got to the missing boy, and he was like, so do you want to know where he is? So I eventually went with on the pointing outs. And those kind of scenes of crime you never forget. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. So when they went to pick him up, he was on his way out to sea, so he was going to the harbour. And also he'd been at the body that morning. So he'd actually sodomized the deceased and then committed necrophilia.
Wilken had stuffed the body's anus with newspaper to keep it free from insect infestation so that he could continue to sodomize the boy for days after his death.
So Stuart Wilken was born on the 11th of November 1964. Not long thereafter, he's down in the Eastern Cape province, and he's found him and his sister in a telephone booth by a passerby, it seems. He was about 3 or 4 months old at the time, and his sister was about 3 or 4 years old at the time.
Unfortunately, the two children would soon find themselves in a less than ideal environment after their discovery by a local black domestic worker.
She decided to take Stuart and his younger sister to her employer at the time. And unfortunately for Stuart and his sister, this is quite possibly the worst thing that she could have done, because the man that took care of them was himself a monster.
The neighbor notices that he's been abused physically. She notices cigarette burn marks on his genitals, on his body. He's not well kept in terms of being washed. His hair is full of lice.
Unsurprisingly, his antisocial behavior intensified.
In February 1990, the body of a 16-year-old boy is found on the Cilia High School in Port Elizabeth property. He's later identified as Monte Fico. He's naked, He's lying on his back, his legs are spread open, and the cause of death is strangulation.
He said he was having sex with the guy, and the little boy started to complain and moan. At that point, he decided to strangle him. He said obviously when he strangled him, then he ejaculated. And that was part of his modus operandi. He would say to us he couldn't ejaculate if he wasn't physically strangling the life out of the person, because it made him feel like he was a god, and he was in absolute control.
What Stuart Wilken used to do when he strangled his victims is that he made sure that they were facing him, and he would not stop until he came across what he referred to as the jelly bean effect. And that was when their eyes and their tongues would bulge out of their orifices to almost popping.
So his second victim was Jenny Geisman, and she was a street prostitute. He described that taking her to the school, they were having sex. He said she was quite large inside, he wasn't enjoying it. So he then tried anal sex with her, which made her quite angry, and at that point she started to resist and fight, when he then strangled and killed her.
Now we jump forward to January of 1991, and the body of an adult female is found in St. George's Park. She's partially clothed, and she has a ligature around her neck.
A profiler's nightmare.
Stuart Wilken's victim profile is quite unique in the fact that he had two types of victims. His primary type of victim was, of course, sex workers. His other victims were street children. He raped them, he sodomized them, and he murdered them.
If I look at Stuart, he didn't try and really cover up his victims. He left them out to display, kind of shock to society. He's basically saying, if a kid finds us or a little girl finds, I don't care.
With at least 3 murders now behind him, Wilken's confidence grew. But much like many other serial killers, his tastes were also evolving.
So now we jump forward just over 4 years to July 1995. We find the body of an adult female in Prince Alfred Park. She's completely naked. She's lying on her back, her arms apart, and her legs spread open. Now, this is for me probably the most fascinating case out of all these cases in this particular series.
This victim, he both cut her nipples and a sexual organ, and committed picarism, which is stabbing into the stomach area repeatedly. The psychologists can tell you a bit more about that and why they do that, but our understanding is that in the mental state they're trying to get back into the womb. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but at one point he said, you know, Derek, you like the smoothing, you like this good look at the chicks like you, but you've never cut a woman's sexual organs apart and eaten it.
To date, Wilken had killed 3 young boys and 3 sex workers. His next victim would later come to baffle investigators.
Now we jump forward 1 year to around about May 1996, where the skeletonized body of what appears to be a young female is found in the Port Elizabeth area. There doesn't appear to be clothing nearby. She seems to be covered with something. There's no flesh at all on this particular victim's body, and we're not quite sure at this point who this individual is. However, through dental records, she's later identified as being the body of 1A Wilken.
I was saying to him, you know, we've got this body that we found, and you're aware that the press and everyone's speculating it's your child. And then he took us to go and see where the daughter's clothes were, and he couldn't find her underwear. So this was one of the funny things that happened in this case for me, where I think it's the only time I ever probably got scared, was he was on his hands and knees growling like a dog and scratching in the sand like he's trying to find her underwear. And it was like quite shocking, but he told us that he would pack out his daughter's clothes, lie them on the ground, and he would lie next to the clothes and then talk to her. In hindsight, he never openly would display this, but he raped her and he slept with her, committed necrophilia with her dead body.
So as we've seen with many other criminal offenders who first initially do a confession and a pointing out, they often don't plead guilty in court.
Then head and founder of South Africa's Forensic Psychology Unit, Mickey Pistorius, was called to give evidence.
And then when Mickey was testifying, she was describing certain of his actions, and he actually asked, can the court please just adjourn, because he had to go down to the cells to go and masturbate.